Here we are again today at the Jeremiah Bible study. I'm going to start with something a little different today. Please turn to Judges chapter 3. Judges chapter 3. We'll be starting with verse 12. I'll give you a second to find it. That's Judges chapter 3, verse 12. And the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. Then he gathered to himself the people of Ammon and Amalek, went and defeated Israel, and took possession of the city of palms. This city of palms is in almost every commentary called Jericho, although I don't completely understand how this could be Jericho when Jericho was destroyed. But maybe it's some sort of a settlement in Jericho or around Jericho without walls. But the irony certainly is not lost here that when the Israelites came and they entered into the promised land, they crossed over the Jordan River, and the first thing they conquered was Jericho. And here we have the Moabites who live on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea slash Jordan River, who are crossing the Jordan River and conquering at least something in the vicinity of Jericho. Verse 14, so the children of Israel served Eglon, king of Moab, 18 years. But when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. By him the children of Israel sent tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud made himself a dagger. It was a double-edged and a cubit in length, and fastened it under his clothes on his right thigh. So he brought the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. And when he had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who had carried the tribute. But he himself turned back from the stone images that were at Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he said, keep silence. And all who attended him went out from him. See, being left-handed, they would have frisked him. They would have frisked his left side. In other words, what they would consider any kind of a soldier who's worth his weight would be right-handed. He would reach down, grab his sword, and stab. But a left-handed person, of course, would do it the other way. So when he was frisked, they didn't realize that he had a sword. Verse 20, so Ehud came to him. Now he was sitting upstairs in his cool private chamber. Then Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. So he arose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the dagger from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And his entrails came out. Then Ehud went out through the porch and shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. When he had gone out, Eglon's servants came to look, and to their surprise, the doors of the upper room were locked. So they said, he is probably attending to his needs in the cool chamber. So they waited till they were embarrassed and still had not opened the doors of the upper room. Therefore they took the key and opened them, and there was their master fallen dead on the floor. And of course, that is the catalyst that sets out for Israel essentially throwing off the yokes of Moab and no longer being under control of Moab. So you may be already kind of cluing in here that we're going to be talking about Moab today. We are in Jeremiah chapter 48, and this is the passage where Jeremiah essentially prophesies the judgment upon Moab. And Moab has had quite a history with Israel, a lot of back and forth, as you're going to see in this lesson today. In the passage we just looked at, Moab had the upper hand, and that's because of this cycle that's in the book of Judges. See, in the book of Judges, it'll often be that the children of Israel sinned. God allowed them to be subjugated to one of the other nations around them. Last week we talked about the Philistines. The Philistines had subjugated Israel. They were thrown off by a judge named Samson. Here we're talking that was towards kind of the end of the judges period. This is more the beginning of the period of the judges, where the Moabites had controlled Israel. And what happens is the Israelites sin, they're subjugated to one of their neighbors, one of their enemies. Then they cry out to the Lord because the punishment is so harsh. And then God sends a judge and they're saved. And then things go great. And then they become complacent and sin again. It's this downward spiral. And you could even say that the time of Jeremiah is kind of continuing this downward spiral, that it goes beyond just the time of judges. And now they're essentially being sold into captivity into the Babylonians, which God will eventually save them from that as well. So it's kind of a continuation of this downward spiral of the cycle in Judges. The point I'm making here is this history that Moab and Israel have with one another, and they're relatives. Moab is one of the incestuous sons, along with Ammon, one of the incestuous sons of Lot, and Lot was Abraham's nephew. So essentially, Israel being descendant of Abraham and Moab being descendant of Lot, they're distant cousins, you could say. So much to the point that when the children of Israel came up out of the wilderness, out of Sinai, God said specifically, you're not to take any of the land of Moab. You're not to fight them. You're supposed to just pass on through. Of course, the Moabites didn't allow the Israelites free passage, and we're going to get into that as well. But please turn to Jeremiah chapter 48. Against Moab, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, woe to Nebo, for it is plundered. Now you're gonna hear a lot of names of locations that are in Moab, and I'm not going to comment on all of them. Many of these places are mentioned in Numbers, but some of them aren't mentioned anywhere else in the Bible at all. So just understand that these are places in Moab. This first place, Nebo is reference to Mount Nebo. Mount Nebo is where Moses went when he looked upon the promised land. Moses never entered into the promised land, but he looked upon the promised land. It was said from Mount Nebo, he could see all the way to pretty much all of the land, all the way up to Lebanon. Lebanon is associated with the White Cap Mountains up there. Lebanon actually means white. So he could see pretty much all the land, and you look directly across from Moab over to Jerusalem and to Bethlehem, to Judah. And this would be a little bit far north of there. It wasn't Moab land, actually, at first. This was part of the land that the Israelites conquered and would become Reuben. But by this time period, by Jeremiah's time period, the Moabites had pushed back the Reubenites, and they had a settlement close to Nebo, and so that's probably this is probably a reference to a settlement maybe at the foothills of Mount Nebo. For it is plundered. Kiriathaim is shaken and taken. The high stronghold is shamed and dismayed. Moab's known for its strongholds. We're going to talk a little bit about in a little bit towards the end of this chapter, we're going to talk about a place called Basra, which is a little bit confusing as to what's going on with this. But Basra is associated with Petra. It's also associated with end times, when the Israelites are going to have to flee Jerusalem and they're going to have to hide from Antichrist. All this stuff, remember, is on the eastern side of the Jordan, or eastern side of the Dead Sea. not Israel proper, but kind of the extended environs around Israel on the east. So we're gonna talk a little bit about strongholds, but Moab is really protected as far as natural geographic boundaries. You have the Arnon, and then now in the north, which is kind of a wadi, you have or a dry riverbed. You have another like dry creek bed to the south. You have the Dead Sea to the west, perhaps even butting up into where Sodom and Gomorrah had once been in the west there. And then you have on the eastern part is just all desert. So it's pretty naturally protected. There is the King's Highway that runs up and runs north and south through this area. Moab, this area of Moab is the area currently in modern day Jordan, the nation of Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. It doesn't get very much water, but it's thought to be the least amount of water possible for farming without constant irrigation. So as such, there were many droughts. It just have to be a slightly less than average year for it to be a drought, and it would have been very difficult to grow crops. The Moabites, as such, they didn't have a lot of food. They didn't have a lot of wealth as compared to other nations, but they found ways to be able to support themselves. They, of course, would try farming, but it would be very difficult in this arid land. It's kind of the irony with we saw with King Eglon that he was a fat man. That this area that's not known for producing a lot of food would produce this fat king. And you have other sources of income. So there would have been a toll, most likely, in that area when people went through the King's Highway, that they would get a kind of a share of the trades that were going through their territory. Remember that balm in Gilead that we've talked about multiple times in earlier in the book of Jeremiah, the trade of balm from the eastern areas of Israel, the part of the land on the eastern side of the Jordan that Israel had as its allotment, as its inheritance, and that was Gilead, or part of Gilead was that inheritance, and they would have taxed the balm that was heading down to Egypt because it would have gone through the nation of Moab. Of course, Moabites wouldn't have let an army go through, but they would let traders go through because that was a source of income. We're going to see a little bit later, they were also known for sheep herding, and they were known for wine. Although I'm guessing it wasn't very good wine, but we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. The sheep herding is going to be maybe a little bit later. You've got a king of Moab, King Mesha, and he's important in history because of what's called the Moabite stone, or the Mesha stele, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's an inscription from King Mesha, and he's known as a sheep herder. Well, let's keep on reading here a little bit more. Verse 2: No more praise of Moab. In Heshbon they have devised evil against her. Come, let us cut her off as a nation. You also shall be cut down, O madmen. The sword shall pursue you. A voice of crying shall be from Oranaim, plundering and great destruction. Moab is destroyed. Her little ones have caused a cry to be heard, for in the ascent of Luhit they ascend with continual weeping. For in the descent of Anaraim the enemies have heard a cry of destruction. Flee for your lives and be like the juniper in the wilderness. For because you have trusted in your works and your treasures, you also shall be taken. And Chemosh shall go forth into captivity, his priests and his princes together. I just mentioned the Moabite stone, or the Mesha stele, which is another word for the Moabite stone. Go ahead and look it up. It's got an interesting history itself as far as how it was found in the modern era from the Bedouins who broke the stone out of spite, and various world empires who got involved in that. But know that this inscription is important because it talks about places like Gad, the tribe of Gad, one of the 12 tribes of Israel that's over on the eastern shore, or east of the Jordan/Dead Sea, which would have been in the proximity of Moab. It talks about Gad. It talks about how the Moabites had been subject to the Israelites. I hope that by now in this study that everyone is familiar with the separation of the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom of Israel. There was a King Omri, who had his palace in Samaria. He was in the northern kingdom of Israel, and he subjugated the Moabites. You see how I'm saying this lesson is going to be this back and forth of the history between the Israelites and the Moabites, because the Moabites subjugated Israel in the time of Judges, but later in the time of the kings of Israel, Moab was subjugated, had to pay a tribute to Israel, had to pay a tribute to its king in Samaria. And they, in this mesh of steel, what's really important is mention of the God of Israel, the four letters Yod He Vav He, which are probably pronounced Yahweh, is mentioned in this stele. Some people say this is the oldest surviving inscription that has God's name in it. So it's very important for supporting the Bible. It also supports the Bible. And then it mentions that this king at this time, Mesha, he was a sheep herder. And the Bible also talks about him being a sheep herder. He probably either brought sheep herding in to Moab, or he just made it more widespread. It's a perfect place for sheep herding because, like I said, it's not real good for farming. So, sheep can eat a lot of that vegetation that maybe people can't, those desert plants, or maybe failed crops. I don't know what they had before that. Maybe they had goats, but sheep was definitely an important source of income at that time, and they were able to throw off the yoke of Israel, meaning the northern kingdom, and they also mocked Israel at that time, and they mocked Israel's God. They mocked Yahweh, and they said that their God, Chemosh, was greater than the God of Yahweh. They said that their God, Chemosh, allowed them to be subjugated. And where did they get this idea? I think they got it from the Israelites, because the one true God had allowed the Moabites to control them during the time of Judges. So this is a reverse of that, at least in their mind, that now Yahweh's God was, or the Israelites' God, Yahweh, was stronger, but their God was now ultimately stronger. Although, a little more history between the Moabites and the Israelites. Think back again to when the Israelites came into the land. They had departed Egypt, where they were slaves. They wandered in the wilderness of Sinai for 40 years. Then finally, when 40 years were up, they had the okay to enter into the promised land. They went up and they wanted to cross through. They went up the King's Highway. They wanted to cross through Moab. And their God Yahweh even told them, don't do any harm, don't plunder, do anything in Moab, because this is Lot's descendant. This is one of your relatives. This is someone who Yahweh also cared about. Though he didn't have that kind of covenantal relationship like he did with Israel, but he had some care for Moab. Although Moab didn't care for Israel at all. They had a king in Moab at that time named Balak, or Balak. And he hired a a prophet from Midian, Midian also being a descendant of Abraham. So this is all, kept in the family here, all disputes between family members. This guy, Balaam, who even has a talking donkey, if you're familiar with the story, Balaam attempts to curse the Israelites in the name of Yahweh. So how is it that Midianites were worshiping Yahweh and Moabites who were in league seeing this was perfectly natural to be worshiping Yahweh? I think it's because at one time the Midianites did worship Yahweh, and even the Moabites worshiped Yahweh. Why would they have worshipped Yahweh? Because Lot worshiped Yahweh and Abraham worshiped Yahweh. And maybe, and the most famous Moabite of all was Ruth, who has a whole book written about her, who's a grandmother to King David. Maybe it didn't seem so strange when she was worshiping Yahweh, because there may have very well been a history of worship of Yahweh worship in Moab. Maybe even a minority of the people worshipped Yahweh all along. So it could have this could have kind of been a natural thing for her to go back, to go live in Israel and with her husband, and maybe it wasn't such a difficult transition. It wasn't like with Solomon when he had a Moabitess wife and he started worshiping Chemosh, this guy. But I think here God is kind of turning the tables back here on the Moabites. Moabites, he allowed the Moabites to take over and control the Israelites. He threw them off with Ehud, with his judge. Then they interpret this as this fight between gods, and Yahweh is stronger than their god Chemosh, wherever Chemosh came from, I don't know. But then you have God getting the final word here. Here he is through his prophet Jeremiah saying, you've boasted, and we're going to see a little bit more about how the Moabites boasted when the northern nation of Israel was taken into captivity, and they basically slammed Yahweh. They slammed the one true God in preference to their false god Chemosh, and God's going to have the last word. He's saying, my ally, if you remember this earlier in the book of Jeremiah, God said his ally is Babylon. Babylon is God's tool to have judgment upon Israel, or Judah at that time. Well, we didn't talk about what happens to the other nations. Last week we did. We talked about what happened to the Philistines. The Philistines get wiped out as a culture and wiped out as a people. Where they're descendants of the Philistines who, intermingled with other people who have come there, quite likely, but they cease to have their own identity. The same thing's going to happen with Moab. Moab's going to cease to have a national identity after this time period. So God's going to get the last word. Just like when the Babylonians came to the temple and they carried off the articles, the articles of the Lord, they're going to go to the temple of Chemosh and they're going to carry off his articles. And what's the most important article that they had there? Well, the statue itself. See, here's one of the problems with having your deity be a statue. In Israel, they didn't have a statue as their deity. Of course, the ark was captured, but the closest thing the ark could be would be like a throne of God. And it's not, they're not saying it's God himself, whereas in many cases, these false gods, they're saying the statue is the God himself. And he's going to be taken off into captivity. When the ark was taken into captivity, what happens? The Philistine god bows down to it, meaning the statue falls in front of it. And then it gets sent back. It shows God showed his power over Dagon, the god of the Philistines. Now he's showing his power over Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and that he's having his tool, Babylon, take the god into captivity. And apparently he's also going to take the priests into captivity. I don't know if they're going to set up some kind of makeshift altar in Babylon, because of course the people in Babylon were polytheists as well, but certainly they see that their Babylonian gods are more powerful than Chemosh. And this is what's oftentimes happening in the ancient world, that the winner of the battle is saying, our God is more powerful than your God, because they're all often polytheists, often believing that the other nation has a God, but it's just not a very powerful God. Whereas we know that Israel is the only one that actually had a true God. Of course, maybe Moab earlier in history, if indeed they were Yahweh worshippers at the beginning, but somehow they threw off Yahweh and they took Chemosh, and that was kind of their downfall. They should have stuck with Yahweh. Maybe they could have been closer friends with Judah. Maybe they wouldn't have mocked Israel. Maybe they wouldn't have drawn God's wrath. God is getting the last word here. Let's read that again, verse 7. And let's read this and thinking about this actual statue being the chief deity of the Moabites, Chemosh. For because you have trusted in your works and your treasures, you also shall be taken, and Chemosh shall go forth into captivity, his priests and his princes together. And the plunder shall come against every city. No one shall escape. The valley also shall perish, and the plain shall be destroyed, as the Lord has spoken. We're going to find later Arab tribes and Edomites will come and settle in the land that was Moab. You're not going to have a national identity of Moab anymore after this time period. Give wings to Moab, that she may flee and get away, for her cities shall be desolate, without any to dwell in them. Maybe a little bit of hint there that some of the Moabites escape. Verse 10, cursed is he who does the work of the Lord deceitfully, and cursed is he who keeps back his sword from blood. Commentators I've read have equated this with, remember we talked about Babylon as God's tool, and essentially, Babylonian soldiers as God's soldiers. So cursed if they don't do their best, if they don't put everything into killing Moabites and plundering Moab, because this is God's work of judgment upon Moab. Verse 11, Moab has been at ease from his youth. He has settled on his dregs and has not been emptied vessel to vessel, nor has he gone into captivity. Therefore his taste remained in him, and his scent has not changed. Remember I said that they don't get a lot of water. They don't get a lot of rain in Moab. And the same is true today in Jordan. Actually, when I lived in Israel, I remember there was, and I went over to Jordan and a couple of times, 2-3 times, and observed the land over there. I remember that they would say on the radio, and then of course the translator had to tell me from Arabic, but they would say on the radio, Israel's stealing our water again. It was kind of conspiracy theory that maybe Israel had planes and they were going up and they were seeding the clouds only on the Israel side of the border and not the Jordanian side of the border. But it's not something that was new to modern times. This has always been the case that Israel, well, not always, but as that's why Ruth's husband moves to Naomi and Ruth's husband moves to the land in the first place, is that there was a drought in Israel, probably God judging Israel. That again, see this back and forth between Moab and Israel, droughts and captivity, and this apparent perceived notion of gods fighting one another. They probably had lots of vineyards, or I should say they absolutely had vineyards in Moab. And so because these are wine type metaphors, having wine on its dregs or wine on its lees, as some of your translations may be, is something that is even done in viticulture today. something done in California where occasionally, I studied to be a sommelier, and sometimes I'll run across a bottle that was left on its lees for a certain amount of time. That is the 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 skins of the grapes, sometimes stems as well. It's left, the wine is left to soak in that to impart more flavor upon the wine. Um, and the longer you leave it on there, the more flavor it's going to get from that. And sometimes it's, the winemaker wants to get it to the exact right amount of what particular flavor because of the wine that he or she is trying to create here. Uh, so it's a tool used to flavor the wine, and apparently it was something that they did. And so here God is using their language to kind of explain their judgment upon them. That, I left you alone. I didn't have the Israelites plunder you when they first came into the land. You didn't go into captivity with the Assyrians, and actually you mocked Israel when the northern kingdom went into captivity. You've basically been protected. You had the Arnon, and you had the other brook in the south, and you had the Dead Sea, and you had the desert. You've basically been protected all this time, but now your day is coming. It's like you've been sitting on your lees. You've been gaining all this flavor. Now it's time for the next process of winemaking to come. So imagine this wine talking. By the way, I think the reason why they would have had wine is, like I said, it had just enough rain to grow, but again, a bad year, it would have killed off all normal plants. But what grapevines do is they shoot down what's called a taproot. This is often the case in Europe as well. When wine is in harsh conditions, and harsh conditions also often makes for very good wine. When grapevines are in harsh conditions, they shoot down what's called a taproot. It doesn't happen in the United States much because of all the irrigation that's going on. But this taproot is it makes that kind of wine that you like because it imparts those minerals, those deep down groundwater minerals that are in the groundwater. And so they would have been able to grow wine. And now I'm guessing it wasn't very good wine. And why? Well, because if it was good wine, why wouldn't they be growing wine in Jordan today? So I'm guessing it wasn't that good of wine. It was kind of like wine in Portugal. They had to fortify it to make it good. Who knows what they were doing to it? They must have had a whole process. Part of it was letting it on the lees and mixing and various things. And so God's going to use this metaphor to describe what he's doing to them. Moab has been at ease from his youth. He has settled on his dregs and has not been emptied vessel to vessel, nor has he gone into captivity. Therefore his taste remained in him, and his scent had not changed. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I shall send him wine workers who will tip him over and empty his vessels and break the bottles. Moab shall be ashamed of Chemosh, as the house of Israel was ashamed of Bethel, their confidence. So one of the early kings of the northern kingdom of Israel set up gold calves in the town of Bethel. Bethel means house of God. He set up gold calves there for the people to worship so that they wouldn't go down to Jerusalem to worship at the Lord's temple there. And he said, these are the gods who brought you out of Egypt. And of course, Israel was ashamed of them. But the people of Moab interpreted it as, look at, Yahweh is not very powerful because his temple in Bethel has been destroyed. Well, that wasn't Yahweh's temple at all. That was temple of these gold calves, kind of, an extension of what had happened in the wilderness when Moses went out to Mount Sinai and Aaron said, I just threw this gold into the fire and this gold calf came up. So they're mocking, and they're mocking God, although they're not really mocking God because it's not really the Lord's temple at all. but in their mind it is, and that's enough for God to want to really place some judgment upon them. Verse 14, how can you say we are mighty and strong men for the war? Moab is plundered and gone up from her cities. Her chosen young men have gone down to the slaughter, says the king, whose name is the Lord of hosts. The calamity of Moab is near at hand, and his affliction becomes quickly. Bemoan him, all you are around him, and all you know his name. Say, how the strong staff is broken, the beautiful rod. O daughter inhabiting Dibon, come down from your glory, and sin and thirst, for the plunderer of Moab has come against you. He has destroyed your strongholds. O inhabitant of Aroer, stand by the way and watch. Ask him who flees, and her who escapes. Say, what has happened? Moab is shamed, for he is broken down. Wail and cry. Tell it in Arnon that Moab is plundered. Remember, Arnon is that area that is natural protection, a wadi. Verse 21, and judgment has come upon the plain country, on Holon and Jaza and Mephath, on Dibon and Nebo and Beth Diblathaim, on Kiriaim and Beth Gamul and Beth Meon, on Kiriat and Basra. And this is interesting here, Basra, especially because Basra is a place that's mentioned in end times prophecy as the place where the Israelites will have to go. That hasn't even happened yet. Jesus talks about a time when the Israelites will have to flee, or we could say Israelis because they're not really called Israelites anymore today. They're going to have to flee Jerusalem when the abomination who makes desolation is sitting in the holy place. One of the places they're going to go to hide from Antichrist is Basra. There's some confusion. Next week we're going to talk about Basra again, but it's going to be associated with Edom. Well, the rabbis say there's really just one Basra, even though a lot of commentators say maybe there was two different places called Basra. And it's associated probably with Petra. The ancient rabbis said there was just one Basra. But one of the kings of Edom came from Basra, and that's why it's listed in lists of Edom cities, even though it was controlled by Moab. So I don't know. But just think this association with dwellings in caves. The Edomites, of course, had dwellings or essentially cities dug out of stone. Places that would have been very difficult to be captured by even armies like the Babylonians, but the Babylonians were determined. So I think this whole area in the dry area of what's Jordan today had probably a lot of areas, caves or human dugout crevices for protection for living in, so that they could very well have been two Basras or just one. But just know that Basra is important in end times. So we continue on the rest of verse 24. On Kiriat and Basra, on all the cities of the land of Moab, far and near, the horn of Moab is cut off, and his arm is broken, says the Lord. Make him drunk, because he exalted himself against the Lord. Moab shall wallow in his vomit, and he shall also be in derision. For was not Israel a derision to you? Was he found among thieves? For whatever you speak of him, you shake your head in scorn. So because they shook their head in scorn and mocked Israel, and they rejoiced when Israel was taken captivity, well, at least the northern kingdom, and they may well have done that with Jerusalem as well. And I'm not sure what the timeline is, whether Moab or Jerusalem was conquered first by the Babylonians, but they mocked them, and and this is God paying them back. This is God judging Moab for what they've done. I've talked before about the three reasons why God generally judges nations, and that is for harming innocents, for sexual sins, and for being harmful to Israel. And of course, Moabites were harmful to innocent people. They were and it wasn't as widespread as in Ammon. They did have some child sacrifices. They were definitely harmful towards Israel. They're associated with sexual sins, although I can't give specific examples of Moabites with sexual sins, but certainly they're right in the region of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is almost prophetical in itself, and they're the descendants of a sexual sin of an incestuous relationship, a child born to Lot and his daughter. Verse 28, you who dwell in Moab, leave the cities and dwell in the rock, and be like the dove which makes her nest in the sides of the cave's mouth. Here it's kind of sounding like Petra. Verse 29, we have heard the pride of Moab. He is exceedingly proud of his loftiness and arrogance, the pride and the haughtiness of his heart. I know his wrath, says the Lord, but it is not right. His lies have made nothing right. Therefore I will wail for Moab, and I will cry out for all Moab. I will mourn for the men of Kir Heres. O vine of Sibmah, I will weep for you with the weeping of Jazer. Your plants have gone over to the sea. They reach to the sea of Jazer. The plunderer has fallen on your summer fruit and your vintage. Joy and gladness are taken from the plentiful field and from the land of Moab. I have caused wine to fail from the winepress. No one will tread with joyous shouting. No joyous shouting. We're continuing our metaphor of Moab, the winemakers having the problems associated with wine, being like that wine, being like broken vessels, and being pressed in the wine press. Verse 34, from the cry of Heshbon to Eleleh to Jahaz, they have uttered their voice. From Zoar to Oranaim. Zoar, I believe, is the place where Lot actually fled from Sodom and Gomorrah, or were like a 3-year-old heifer. For the waters of Nimrim also shall be desolate. Moreover, says the Lord, I will cause to cease in Moab the one who offers sacrifices in the high places and burns incense to his gods, God, little g. Therefore my heart shall wail like flutes for Moab, and like flutes my heart shall wail for the men of Kir Heres. Therefore the riches they have acquired have perished. For every head shall be bald, and every beard clipped. On all the hands shall be cuts, and on the loins sackcloth. Remember the people after Jerusalem was destroyed, they were coming down from the north, and they had cuts, and they were showing signs of mourning, much like this. This is a typical ancient Middle Eastern signs of great devastated mourning. Verse 38, a general lamentation on all the housetops of Moab and in its streets. For I've broken Moab like a vessel in which is no pleasure, says the Lord. They shall wail, how she is broken down, how Moab has turned her back with shame. So Moab shall be a derision and a dismay to all those about her. For thus says the Lord, behold, one shall fly like an eagle and spread his wings over Moab. Kiriat is taken, and the strongholds are surprised. The mighty man's heart in Moab on that day shall be like the heart of a woman in birth pangs. And I think here you have maybe reference to perhaps this area being known for birds, for eagles, maybe for people who are fowlers who catch birds. Verse 42, and Moab shall be destroyed as a people because he exalted himself against the Lord. Here's the cusp of this whole chapter. This is the why. This is why this is happening to Moab. Let me read it again. Moab shall be destroyed as a people because he exalted himself against the Lord. And that can be very well shown on the Mesha Stele. Verse 43, fear and pit under the snare shall be upon you, O inhabitant of Moab, says the Lord. He who flees from the fear shall fall into the pit. He who gets out of the pit shall be caught in the snare. For upon Moab, upon it, I will bring the year of their punishment, says the Lord. Those who fled stood under the shadow of Heshbon because of exhaustion. But a fire shall come out of Heshbon, a flame from the midst of Sion, and shall devour the brow of Moab, the crown of the head of the sons of tumult. Woe to you, O Moab! The people of Chemosh perish, for your sons have been taken captive and your daughters captive. Yet it will bring back the captives of Moab in the later days, says the Lord. Thus far is the judgment of Moab. I don't know what this means about I will bring back the captives of Moab in the later days, but I'll be interested to find out through the course of time to see what the Lord has in store for end times things. God bless you.